So, obviously, set the context for the discussion we're about to have. Delighted to be joined by three fellow panelists who have very different and interesting backgrounds. I'll let them introduce themselves. So, Jackie, if I could start with you, since you're immediately to my right.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Jackie Anderson. I'm Director of ICT Data and Change at Enable. We are a non-profit organisation where most of our staff deliver frontline services in the social care. I feel almost like a fraud sitting up here based on the technical conversations, but I'm trying to look at it from the city charity perspective and the non-profit. So as I've said to a lot of people today, I'm a taker rather than a giver, but I'm hoping that the contributions up here will give some food for thought.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Maddie Hutchinson. I'm the head of tech philanthropy at Morgan Stanley, and my team's really focused on leveraging our 17,000 technologists globally to give back using their technical skills. So we do that through a variety of different skills-based volunteering opportunities like pro bono and tech education and hackathons.
Hello everyone, my name's Alwan Smith. I am a product manager working at a company called GitHub. We build a tool there, and I actually do day-to-day. I work a lot on a tool called GitHub Copilot, which is one of the first, pretty much the first AI-assisted software engineering tool. It's used by a lot of people around the world. And yeah, more generally, I have done a fair amount of work in open source software and think about how communities can set themselves up to be receptive to contributions or successful contributions. And I'm also just starting to volunteer a bit with the STA. So, yeah.
Great stuff. Thank you all very much. So I was saying in the previous session that what we're looking to do is to address the challenge of the maintenance burden that comes with a lot of the really good tech for good work that gets done. How do we address the duplication that exists, and how do we make sure that these solutions are not only great the day they get delivered, but can continue to be used and to be developed potentially and reused. So Jackie, maybe we could start with you. Obviously, I know you've worked with some of the corporate programs, or it was before your time, I think, but Enable as an organisation has done. So really great to get your kind of perspective on it from that side of things to start with.
Yeah, I mean, before, in fact, it's across the way you mentioned JP Morgan. Enable had some funding through JP Morgan around 2017 to develop an app. You know, it was a great app. It was fit for purpose at the time. It goes to a department that you don't actually talk to IT, and before you know it, it's in 2024, and they're like, the app stopped working, and it's like, right, we didn't know the app was actually out there in the first place. So it's never been redeveloped, and that's something where, and it's been mentioned before with various panelists, it's all very well having a good idea, working with STA, but it's all about how do we keep the support going, because we don't, you know, Enable, you know, we're a large charity, but we don't have an endless pit of money where we can support everything. So it's like, how do you ensure that the solutions that come, we've got that sort of maintenance pack that we can continue. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge out there.
And Maddie, obviously, both your current role and the role you had before at JP Morgan, I mean, this comes to the point about the fact that, you know, the work's done in good faith, a really valuable outcome is delivered, but that's as far as the company can take it. So obviously something you've seen up close and firsthand for a long time, so it's really great to get your perspective in terms of what is and isn't possible in these kind of programs.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, the story that Enable had isn't dissimilar to what may happen a couple years after delivery. And I think a lot of corporate programs, because of limitations of not being able to sustain having maintainable, you know, support throughout delivery. So a lot of programs, corporates that run these types of programs, it's usually at the end of the engagement, we hand it over, train, and now it's yours to start using. And so I think a lot of organizations after the first initial years can have trouble sometimes, especially if it's not the best sustainable choice for the organization in being able to make those updates and changes. And so from our side, on the corporate side, we're really excited about this repository as an opportunity to then start open sourcing some of the work that we're doing, so that when it does come to maintenance, you know, it can be a community around not only our corporate volunteers, but others in STA or in the community more generally to be able to keep these going. And I think that there's a lot of things that change for charities over a 12 to 18 month period, and sometimes the tech doesn't keep up with that. And so I think things like these repository can bring a lot more shared reusability and resources to charities so that they can get the latest and greatest when it comes to these apps or databases or whatever it may be that can help them scale their mission.
Yeah. Just to follow that thread a little bit, what's your view, your experience of the appetite and the willingness of corporations to open source things? There's a range of views. I think it's fair to say. It's probably worth mentioning that you also, both in your previous role and now, have been coordinating a collective of the organizations that have these programs. So it might be useful just to talk a little bit about that and some of the feedback you've had from those groups as to their attitude towards this kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I'll say that this is my personal opinion and not the opinion of Morgan Stanley. But as
or any of the other 34 companies.
As you can imagine, a lot of legal red tape and compliance around open sourcing things. I think companies are getting more in tune that this is kind of the way of the future, and they're wanting to open source things. There's great industry-wide organizations around open source now. Finos is one of them. I don't know if any of you have heard of them, but really trying to promote open sourcing across the financial services industry. So I think there's some appetite there, but the way that programs, pro bono programs in-house and corporate have been structured previously, I don't know if there was always that appetite for open source. So I think it's something that we're trying to champion and make sure it's happening, because I think there's a lot of hesitation sometimes when it comes to that, and what our employees can and can't do when it comes to contributing to open source. On your second point, as Alistair mentioned, I chair a symposium of individuals in the tech for good space. So we have about 35 or so companies represented who work in this tech for good ecosystem. And it really just started as a great way to connect with other professionals who are in these seats at various companies and learn from each other. Obviously, a lot of us are traditional competitors, but we like to think that this is one space we don't want to be competitive in. And so it started as just groups of friends saying, have you worked with this charity before? How the heck do you set up a pro bono program? What do your legal contracts look like? And kind of learning. But what we've seen since its inception in 2018 is we started to mold into how can we build shared resources that collectively use all of our company's resources and programs to promote social good and help on the nonprofit tech adoption journey. So we've been in conversations with the Scottish Tech Army on how can we have these 35 plus organizations start contributing to that repository and be able to leverage the great work that they're doing in silos as a collective.
Great, thank you. Arfon, obviously your current role, and as you said, your background working in open source projects, there's a very rich history around open source. I mean, it's as you say, Maddie, in corporate world, it's not so popular yet. It's growing, but in the tech community at large, it's been very well established. One of the things I was alluding to in the introduction was that it's all very well putting stuff in, but if nobody can take it out or nobody can contribute to it, then that's obviously of limited value. So really interested in your perspective on what are the characteristics or the attributes of projects that work well in that kind of open source environment. What are the critical success factors, if you like, for something that does manage to gain critical mass and become effective?
Yeah, I'm going to have to use the phrase which is open source is free like a puppy can be free, as in, and not like beer. So this is the phrase, I don't know if you've ever heard of free like pizza, free like beer, or free like a puppy. A puppy comes with costs and requires maintenance and care. And so open source, I think, can be, to open source, to that sort of verb can mean many things. At a minimum, it means putting a license on it and sharing it, which might be incredibly useful, just even that act. But I think that is the absolute minimum, really, of sort of version of sharing. You know, the successful projects and communities, I think, are probably using the thing that they've shared, and the people who are maintaining it know about it. So there are people who are present and responsive if somebody has a question, wants to make a contribution. There's a process that defines what a contribution looks like. Maybe they've thought about the sort of contributor funnel. This is a thing that gets talked a lot about in open source. How do I, if I'm interested in this project, what does it look like to make a first contribution? That's a big part of the sort of onboarding experience. If I do make a contribution and it's not very good, do I get a thanks, but this needs some work, or do I get an angry sort of rage, close, no thank you, go away, please leave us alone type thing? And you know, that's a recognition that a lot of people who do maintain open source software are often doing it as a volunteer activity themselves. So, you know, that time that you are spending, you want it to be spent well, and so, you know, thinking about how to set a project up for success such that contributions can be, you know, triage managed, can be included. I would also say, you know, things like documentation for people who are thinking about using the tool as sort of an absolute must-have. Maybe a community around it that isn't just on somewhere like GitHub, but maybe somewhere a little bit more collaborative like Slack or Discord, somewhere where there's a place where you can go and ask questions. Again, I think there's a lot of fairly good guidebooks out there now. There's actually one, opensource.guide, which is a set of guides that GitHub released years ago that still stand up pretty well and apply really their sort of general principles for sort of community management around a shared technology, I would say.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Jackie, we touched on this challenge around, you know, okay, we've got this repository, it's got all this great stuff in it, how do we start using it? You know, from your perspective, you know, within, as you say, it's a decent-sized organization, so it's not the smaller end of the scale, so, you know, you do have more resource than some. What would good look like for you in being able to access something like that?
It's really, it's knowing what to, I think we were talking about it earlier about the app developments, you know, but it's knowing what to look for, knowing what to ask, know where to start. And it's all very well working with the STA, and you know, we've got a great idea, but then when it's handed over, and again it's passing it forward. So, you know, the solution for us would be great, it will work for us, and then we'll bring it forward so that you can reuse it somewhere else. It's in open source, but for the development side of things, it's, you know, how easy is it going to be? How safe is it going to be from a security perspective? Because if it's open source, you know, where's the governance behind it to make sure that, you know, updates are correct, updates are right, you're installing the right thing within your environment, you don't want to bring down your current environment. So it's probably a nervousness would be from a user that's not at the right technical level, because as much as we're a large charity organisation, we don't have developers, and how do we know that that's the right one, the right product to put in? So it's probably that fear and, you know, what's around the governance on products being uploaded there. I'd probably say that I'm more worried about. Yeah, and that initial assessment of whether something's relevant, whether it might be valuable, you know, Arfon, you're saying it's all over having it in a repository that technical people know how to navigate. What sort of framework or tools would you envisage to help get a better understanding of what's there at a you know, a higher level, rather than at the level of this is what the code actually does, but, you know, this is the use case that it's trying to solve and those kind of things? Well, it's really more about what you know, the framework of whatever we're looking for, security or app development, get on to Azure, just something to direct us, but some sort of hierarchy so that we know exactly where we're going to be looking into. Because sometimes it's, you know, we know what the end game is, but we don't know how to get there. And if we go into open source, it's like, right, where do we start? How do we know what we want at the end? So how do we know what to look for at the beginning to get the right product, and to install the right product, and to pull down and develop the right product? Yeah, yeah.
Can I just add something
Yeah,
on that?
please.
I think that that's a really great point that you said, Jackie, and I think that from the repository standpoint, those case studies are going to be really important in terms of this is how an organization has used it, because in one of the prior sessions we were talking about charities who've worked with the STA, and a lot of them were saying, I thought I needed this thing, and then when I started talking, that's exactly what I didn't need, and STA helped me realize what I did need, which we oftentimes see as well. And so I think those case studies and this is how it's been applied and what that looks like, and then back to Arfan's point of the, free as a puppy, I love that. The true cost of ownership, I think, is something that we need to think of as well when building this out. Is it's not going to be necessarily free for the organizations to be able to adopt that. So how do we help them understand that and really understand resource-wise, funding-wise, et cetera, what it may take to sustain and continue to use these?
Yeah. I mean, our phone, obviously, the Copilot product within GitHub, it's AI-based. Based on what you're doing there, are there ideas that come from that around the discoverability and the visibility of what these solutions do? I know that may not be the focus of Copilot itself, but just knowing the capabilities of the technology, do you see opportunities there?
Yeah, I think I do. I'll say that I think the place listening to the sessions this morning, I was struck by the sort of, 1 day in a year or 3 days or maybe an hour a week or whatever that thing is. It struck me that one of the big challenges that software engineers have in every setting is sort of gaining context quickly to understand how to solve a problem that they're trying to get to. So maybe somebody's reported the app isn't working. Okay, well, maybe I've never looked at this code base ever, or maybe I haven't looked at it in 6 months, or maybe I was looking at it yesterday. You could be in lots of different settings, but especially for larger code bases that have had many contributors over the years, there's a very good chance that you're going to spend, if you've got a few hours, you're going to spend most of that time just figuring out how this thing works before you even get to the now I think I might understand what the source of this bug is. And so I think one of the really exciting opportunities for me, beyond what Copilot does today, Copilot roughly today helps you write code faster, and it has a sort of a chat experience that enables you to ask questions about the code you're looking at. I think one of the big opportunities is to really push on that second angle, which is help use the power of these language models like GPT-4 and other large language models to help developers navigate code and get up to speed faster. I think that's a really big opportunity. Likewise, a bit more speculative, but quite possible. And you can probably see demos on LinkedIn every day about this, or Twitter, or whatever your preferred medium is, but where people are using AI to try and do a first implementation of a solution to a problem that's been identified. This is coming. It is a thing that is quite achievable, especially in the next, I would say, 6 to 12 months. You should expect to see a range of tools that will be available. And that then means that the person who can specify the problem can also potentially do a first version of a candidate solution. Now, depends on how complex that problem gets. But, for some fairly routine tasks, I think we're going to start to see the barrier to contribution come down significantly, which I think is really exciting for a bunch of reasons, but especially in volunteer projects where time is even more precious than in most. Yeah.
Absolutely. Mandy, within the symposium, I know that there has been some collaboration work done, and so it's an ecosystem type approach as well. What are the things that you've seen from that activity to date that would help inform how one might go about this kind of thing?
I think the co-creation is really important. So not only co-creation amongst, in our case, different corporates who are doing this type of work, but also co-creation with the third sector. And I think that's going to be really key to success for any type of collaboration in this space. Obviously, we can build whatever we want to build, but if organizations don't adopt it, it's of no use to anyone. So I think that co-creation is huge. I also think the benefits of being able to work with an STA or some other third party is really helpful when, again, dealing with legal and different red tape we have as traditional competitors working together. That's been really helpful. And then I just think the continuous feedback throughout these collaborations that we have done together before, and getting that feedback from the users and being receptive to that and open to adjusting and agile in nature, I think that was really pivotal to our success in other collaborations that we've had.
Yeah. And Jackie, within Enable, you take a variety of approaches, obviously, to solving the problems using technology. What are the kind of the opportunities and the challenges from your perspective around this idea of looking more externally and seeing what's out there? I mean, there's obviously an overhead in having to go and do that looking as well. What's your approach? When your business colleagues come to you with a problem, and Maddie's talking about the co-creation, which is typically what you're looking for between business and IT anyway. How do you structure that, and how do you go about the options evaluation, and how might this fit into that?
Yeah, a lot of it as well is capacity within the organisation. We'll have, you've got in every organisation, you've got so many different departments, so many different demands, and it's really right, where do we see the priority within the organisation? What's our objectives, our KPIs, what do we want to get out there and to deliver? And in setting that set of priorities, working with strategic partners for a charity is without a doubt one of the key things, because we do not pretend that we know everything about everything, so we want to work with the STA for guidance. We've got strategic partners with security and our city service space, and we want to make sure that it's no question is silly. It's just it's all out there, and it really is just making sure that you're taking counsel with the relevant people to say, we're thinking about doing this. It's like, no, we know where you're going, but no, that's not what you want to do. Right. So really it's making sure you're engaged with the relevant people. I was speaking to one of the ladies earlier during lunch, one of the charities, and they don't have an IT department, and a lot of the reliance at the moment is on STA, because although there's a lot of good tech companies out there, there's also a lot of, I don't want to use the word cowboys, but they would abuse what they see as ignorance from someone who doesn't have a local IT. So it really is just making sure you work with your partners and you take the necessary advice.
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of touching on the importance of being an informed customer, I guess, in all of that. I mean, Maddie, with the programs that you've run, how have you gone about helping to make sure that alignment is there, so that expectations are set and met appropriately?
Yeah, I think from approaching it from a corporate side and going into a pro bono engagement, I think one thing that is really important is doing that kind of analysis of, okay, here's what you're actually looking for, what is that purpose? Sometimes it may seem like a tech issue, but it's really an operational issue or something like that tech can obviously help solve. So I think it's understanding and doing a lot of that learning and listening first before designing what that looks like, thinking about true cost of ownership and sustainability for the organization, and making sure that what you're choosing aligns with that. I think one of the interesting things that I had at JP Morgan and now at Morgan Stanley is, because we don't have a tech product that we're giving to nonprofits, I like to think we kind of wear a every hat type approach, where we will provide, Salesforce instances to nonprofits or WordPress websites, and can kind of do a variety of different things. And through that, do like a solution selection matrix to really make sure, based on your needs, here's all the products out there that are solving that. Here's what checks the box. What do you as an organization want to adopt? So I think a lot of it's that listening and learning, and really making sure that the customer voice is heard throughout the process as well. And I think the shared learning and reusability that we have in doing hundreds of these projects over the past 10 years, seeing what's worked and what hasn't worked. And one thing that I get really excited about in the repository is, oftentimes we might build a solution that works for this type of organization doing this type of thing, but if we're building, let's say, a mentor-mentee matching tool, that can work for organizations who are helping, disadvantaged youth, to job seekers, to, homeless organizations. So there's a lot of, I think, opportunity to collaborate across different missions and focus areas, which I think makes this even more powerful. It's not going to be a, one product fits one org, but hopefully a one product fits many.
Yeah. So earlier on I was talking about some of the research around the impact of AI on productivity in the software world. And one of the quotes is about the fact that, you know, it's not taking away the complex tasks. It should be helping to automate some of the more mundane tasks. And Arfan, you were talking about the importance of documentation in that, you know, the ability to pick things up and hand them on. Is that an area where there's an opportunity to use AI techniques to help with better documentation or even some documentation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's tons of opportunity here, actually, and I think it's lots of people are thinking about this problem. I think there's a few advantages. The first is the docs may be great, they may be terrible, but they'll be written from a perspective of the author, typically, unless there's been extensive review. Usually, certainly when I document stuff, you're just kind of trying to get something down, and you're lucky if anybody ever reads it and suggests changes. You've just sort of done a brain dump, and that's probably as good as it's going to get. So, firstly, you know, you might not be, I mean, we've probably all gone through a tutorial where between steps 6 and 7, you're like, but hang on, I'm not at 7 yet, but I've done 6. There's something missing in between. And that can be, you know, for technology, when you're trying to set up some technology, that can be really frustrating. You get stuck on some kind of unknown middle part of the process. And so AI does a very good job, in particular large language models do a very good job of personalizing the response they give to you based on the particular question you're asking. So there's this opportunity to really give answers that are, as long as they're grounded in reality, so this is called sort of retrieval augmented generation, you're, as long as you're sourcing information from the repository or from some documentation, or maybe places like Stack Overflow or, you know, online forums, for example, the answers are tailored to what you asked, rather than the docs are just static and you just read them, and if they're good, and if they're not, they're not. So there's this real opportunity for personalizing the output directly to the question you're asking, and saying, for example, that's too hard, like make it more basic. Imagine I don't know about this technology, explain that to me. So that kind of dynamic mode of interacting with material, I think, is incredibly powerful. On the sort of creation of documentation, the AIs do a pretty good job of that. So if you say, you know, highlight a block of code and just write me the docs for this, they'll do a pretty good job of that typically. Likewise, you can, this is kind of how the original Copilot worked, you can start with sort of some comments about what you think the code should do, and then the AI will try and write it. So there's some nice sort of symmetry there. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I guess one more thing I'll just say is that I think is intriguing as well is, if you really had a good idea of what sort of questions were being asked, there's potentially an opportunity for AI to try and fill in the gaps in the documentation. And that's something that I think lots of companies are thinking about as well. So tons of opportunities in the doc. Yeah. I'm super excited about docs, by the way, if anyone wants to talk about this.
Absolutely. Can I ask a question? Yeah. So do you feel like the documentation or the models, the AI models, are smart enough to be able to put that documentation in layman's terms, or a nonprofit's able to pick that up and really understand it? Or do you think there's still going to be some manual intervention needed of the documentation to translating for maybe non-technical folk?
Yeah, it's good question. I would say with a suitably powerful model, you've got a pretty good chance of getting a long way. I think it depends how niche the technology is that you're using, but I would argue that I would hope that most sort of volunteer projects are not like creating new programming languages just to solve, you know, they're using things like Python or JavaScript, you know, so provided that it's not a unique sort of technology space that we're operating in, I think there's a pretty good chance. I mean, there is also the thing that you have to be aware of with certainly generative AI is that they are wrong frequently in quite subtle ways. And so one of the things that I always ask people to think about when they're designing technology solutions, so that I work in product, and this is a thing I talk to my colleagues about every single day, is what is the cost of giving an answer that's incorrect? And if the cost is low, then maybe AI is suitable. If the cost is high, so for example, people are very interested in using AI to give credit ratings and decide if you're going to loan people money. The cost of being wrong there is incredibly high. The cost of being wrong in getting step 6A wrong in the onboarding guide maybe that's not so high. Maybe it's better to have that tool try and help, even if occasionally the answer is slightly wrong. So I think it really comes down to sort of responsible use of AI, I guess I would call it.
Absolutely. So, Jackie, you talked about working with strategic partners, and I'm sure you have a range of them. What's your view around how you can combine that kind of relationship with more an open source and an ecosystem type of environment? Because, you know, we all come from the tech sector. We're not trying to put the tech sector out of business, because that's where we all made our livings and all that sort of thing. So that coexistence between, you know, your strategic partner suppliers and this kind of an open source and an ecosystem type approach. You got any thoughts on some of the challenges that might raise?
The relationships we have with our strategic partners is really about how do we, one, deliver better, make the organisation more efficient, but I also want to make sure that we don't become dependent on our strategic partners, that eventually the team internal can grow and do the support and the development in-house. So that really sort of goes on to the whole open source as well. It's like working with, because it really is, it's knowledge transfer from strategic partners in-house, and it's also, right, okay, what's the product, where do they go, do they use open source, you know, looking at the documentation and case studies, and it's about bringing that in-house, but also we're a charity, but you know, we want to help other people as well. So it's like, right, what can we give back? And it's like, what works well, let's get that out in open source as well.
Yeah, so there's an opportunity to be a contributor as well as a
Rather
user
than a taker, yes, yes.
We got you there.
Yes,
yeah. So, Maddie, from the point of view of the corporates, there's lots of lessons around the things that have worked well and the projects that have proved to be sustainable. Are there any kind of patterns or themes that come out of that you know we should be bearing in mind in looking at doing this in a more you know, ecosystem type manner?
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily certain types of projects, but I think the approach to the project that really sets it apart on whether or not it's going to be something that the organization can use for many years, or it's going to be something that we have high hopes that gets used, and the second something goes wrong, it's not used anymore. And I think a lot of that is making sure that whatever is developed integrates nicely into the existing platforms or systems that the organization has. And again, I keep harping on this, but the whole listening and learning before building, I think, is a key factor in that, in making sure that you are really understanding what the organization has, what they're capable of sustaining, what that looks like, what tech skill sets they may have, is there upskilling that needs to go with that. I think that's what sets up projects for success. The technology itself, yes, we need to make sure it's something that is maintainable and sustainable, but I think that really the projects where you see the most success are ones that integrate very nicely with the existing infrastructure that the org has, whether that's super sophisticated or maybe isn't. We like to say that a lot of our nonprofit partners kind of fall on a spectrum of tech adoption. So we have like these very sophisticated, high-level organizations like Enable who have a very large tech presence and are using technology and really innovatively thinking about tech. And then we have organizations who what we call like the accidental techie, right? Like the person who knew how to set up the Zoom account who now takes on the hat of being the technologist. And so I think with this repository as well, it will be interesting to see how we choose what types of projects and solutions work for those organizations depending on where they fall in that spectrum, and making sure that it's, again, something that they can really adopt and use long after we step away.
Absolutely, yeah.
If I can just following on from the sort of listening and learning, and it's something that the STA is good at, is that the proposals that we've got of the outcome that we want, it's like, right, this one will be maybe more fit for purpose, but the maintenance required were a little bit more. This one might not tick all the boxes, but the maintenance isn't as bad. So at least you've got that information, and then you can make a judgment call what's best and suited for yourself. But it is, it's the listening and learning and really pulling out the requirements really helps.
Yeah. Arfon, within GitHub, I mean, there are, God knows how many projects there are and how many repositories there are in GitHub, a big number, but yes, there's loads of them. Are there examples of where, you know, things are aggregated, if you like? So we're talking about, you know, creating a repository that has multiple different projects contained within it. Are there good examples of that within other parts of GitHub that, again, that we can learn from?
Yeah, I think there's a few good examples. One thing I'm kind of struck by, like the software foundations. So folks like the Apache Software Foundation, Linux Foundation, they are an interesting model. It might be worth considering this for this sort of model. It's considered, well, it's a number of things, but the people who contribute software there are typically companies. So Twitter used to contribute a lot of software there. I don't know if they do now under current leadership, but one of the reasons that they contribute there is that often, you know, bluntly, they were done with the technology. It'd been maybe a core part of their infrastructure, and then they'd matured beyond it. But they said, "But this is really good, and it's suitable for loads of people, but we're not using it anymore." So, you know, in the nicest possible terms, they're kind of throwing it over the fence and saying, "Does anyone want this?" But you know, if that also comes with a donation to a foundation that's got a commitment to maintenance, then that could be a great contribution. Linux Foundation does something similar in some ways. They can be a home for valuable projects. Pretty sure the Linux kernel is looked after by the Linux Foundation, but that might not be true. So anyway, but they can also provide a neutral ground for companies to collaborate, and this is one of the amazing things about open source is that it can be a lot easier to convince a corporate lawyer that you're going to go and contribute together on this other thing that nobody owns. We don't own it. Morgan Stanley doesn't own it. Barclays don't own it, but that organization owns it. And so now it's just simply a conversation, not about whether I can collaborate with this other bank, but I just need to, can I get permission, you know, to contribute to that thing? And so it can be a very good sort of neutral ground for collaboration between companies that would otherwise be directly in competition with each other. So foundations is one, but that's quite formal, I would say. Otherwise, there are lots of examples of communities that just organize around shared challenges. So from my own background, there's lots of sort of scientific Python communities, people who are maybe active in particular areas of data science, or often these groups organize around programming languages, actually. So there's, for example, in numerical computing, some people are really excited about a language called Julia, and so people who get interested in the language also then are sort of active in maintaining packages in that space. I'll mention one more, which is this project called ROpenSci. So this is packages written in the R programming language, where the kind of the common theme amongst them is that they are used for open science, so used by people who typically care about publishing open source software to solve scientific problems, but they're generally very useful sort of statistical data science sort of computing packages. But by contributing to our OpenSci, you can actually be accepted as part of the project, and then that comes with a commitment to long-term maintenance by those volunteers. They actually have some paid staff who are, for example, funded by, we saw the Ford Foundation earlier. I believe they actually partially fund the our OpenSci group. And they are part of a bigger non-profit in the US called NumFocus, which is an organization that looks after lots of open source projects. So I think there's lots of models, actually. And I think, you know, I would say it's probably worth sort of trying to pick one rather than kind of just wing it. We haven't talked about this in tons of, but you know, probably worth looking at ones that people are doing and critiquing them, and then trying to adopt one, because I think there's lots of experience that's been learned by lots of different communities.
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting you give that example of Twitter handing over code that it no longer has a use for. Perfect segue into the next session after the break about Soundscape. For those of you who haven't heard the story yet, this was, you are going to, but this is something that Microsoft had developed. They had decided, you know, that research project had come to an end. They didn't have a use for it. They made it available as open source, and you know, that's what we're going to hear about. But in terms of, you touched on the level of the, call it structure, formality, some sort of terms of reference around that. And Maddie, we've talked about this from the point of view of companies potentially contributing their output into this kind of thing. A set of terms of reference at the very least seems important. Just with some of those examples, how extensive have those terms of reference been? The light touch as opposed to very prescriptive.
So in terms of sort of governance of the organisation, or?
Well, the terms of reference, for a contributor to say, by contributing, you're agreeing to do these things. We give you these assurances. This is how it's going to work.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I don't think I know a ton about that, other than to say that I think we should all remember that contributor licensing agreements generally suck for the people who just want to share code. So corporate policies around contribution are generally truly awful. Yeah. And projects that are run by corporations often have very onerous policies where they expect you to sign a document and mail it to them. And if you just want to I found a problem in your software, I'm trying to fix it. Yeah. You open a pull request on GitHub and you get a lawyer talks to you and says, please fill in this form and fax it to us. Then you'll say, sorry, I literally can't be bothered. So contributor licensing agreements, there's lots of work that's gone into that. I think it's still a pretty poor experience from a contributor standpoint. Mm-hmm. So one thing I like is to think about how corporations can solve this, so that you can change this in your employee policies, how you talk about, so GitHub and Microsoft, I think, certainly GitHub has it's an open source document that anyone can use. It's a set of legal agreements where, as an employee of GitHub, basically I know that as long as I'm not contributing code to a direct competitor, I'm fine. Right. I don't have to ask permission. So I can't really contribute code to, I'm trying to think, Code Whisperer, I was talking to somebody from Amazon before. That's not an open source project, but if it were, I wouldn't be allowed to contribute to that, or we'd have a serious conversation about why I was spending time working on that, maybe. But I can definitely contribute to the SDA without asking for permission, because there's no compete there, and it's sort of one of those things, just use your best judgment. And it explicitly says yes, and you're allowed to moonlight doing this, because as long as you're doing your job, this is fine. So I think a lot of it can be actually on the companies that are that employing people who might contribute. I think that's where, honestly, a lot of the friction can be. In my experience.
Okay. Again, Maddie, from the perspective of a potential contributing company, I caught up with your former colleague Ali Morano just recently, and she was saying that this is something that had been discussed within JP Morgan, this idea of trying to collate outputs and that kind of thing, but for one reason or other it didn't get off the ground. What were the kind of obstacles and roadblocks to that happening?
Legal and compliance. No, I know I sound like a broken record, but I think historically, a lot of the hesitation has been that any type of outside business interest, as we call them, that you're doing, whether it be these pro bono tech projects or serving on a nonprofit board or running your own side hustle, there's a lot of red tape that comes around that and what you can and can't do. And so I think that these types of pro bono projects were getting grouped into that. What I'm excited about is because, as Arfan was saying, these STA projects don't really relate to your necessarily day job. A lot of the tech pro bono projects aren't relating to day jobs, that there's now more an appetite to be able to allow for that. So I think where in the past lawyers may have been a little hesitant because it's work being done by Morgan Stanley on the, the behalf of the organization. Now there's a little bit more of an appetite of maybe dipping the toes in, and I'm hopeful that our type of projects can inspire more appetite for open source across the organization. But I think a lot of it was just down to what you were doing as representing the organization, and it did get pretty sticky. There's a lot in the legal documentation on organizations still having to retain ownership and giving perpetual licenses and stuff that doesn't feel necessarily right. So I think the more we can move into this open source ecosystem, the better for all parties involved.
Okay, that sounds like a perfect closing remark. We are out of time. Thank you all very much indeed for that. It's still very early in these discussions, but it's really helpful to get all of your insights. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you, folks.